Now, does anyone recognise these words? When our committee was formed just over 18 months ago, neither our title nor our work programme seemed framed to catch the headlines. In the event, the committee has become the focus of far more attention than I ever envisaged. The harsh economic climate is partly responsible. It is, however, the continuing concern about standards and accountability, heightened by the controversy over pay, which has kept corporate governance in the public eye. Does anybody recognise that? Okay. Now, slightly after that.
Sounds like Adrian Cadbury, yes.
Absolutely, yeah, well done. Yeah. But I think those words could have been written for today. It seems just as relevant. I invited Adrian to join us this morning. Unfortunately, he couldn't come, but he sent his very best wishes for a fruitful debate. And he said that this was an important and relevant conference, so that was praise indeed, I thought, from Adrian. His approach to governance, as we all know, was to have a voluntary code based on best practice, coupled with disclosure. We call it comply or explain. The idea was that shareholders would consider the disclosures and hold boards to account if governance was wanting. Cadbury believed this would allow some flexibility and prove more effective than a statutory code. He recognised, though, that if companies didn't follow the code, then external regulation would come. He thought that regulation would impose a minimum standard, but there would be a greater risk of boards complying with the letter rather than the spirit of their requirements. And I think we still seem to be stuck with that problem. So 18 years after Cadbury, where are we? Well, we had general acceptance of his code. Since then, we've had Greenbury, Hampel, the Combined Code, Turnbull guidance on internal control. Then along came Enron, about 9 years ago, and WorldCom, and that gave rise to a lengthy bit of legislation, Sarbanes-Oxley, and it was very detailed. In the UK, we were grateful that Enron didn't happen here. We thought perhaps our system was better. We'd learnt the lessons. On mainland Europe, however, there was Ahold and Parmalat. So the European Commission took an active interest and still does. Numerous consultations have taken place. Various directives and recommendations have come out on matters such as audit committees, non-executive directors, reporting in accordance with a governance code, and of course directors' pay. In general, the rest of Europe adopted the UK comply or explain approach, and we have stuck to it. Enron and WorldCom highlighted all sorts of failings. In the UK, the DTI commissioned 2 reviews to see whether the UK should do anything. We had the Higgs review of the effectiveness of non-executive directors, and we had the Smith report on audit committees. That led to a longer version of the Combined Code, and since then we've had another version of the Combined Code and revised Turnbull guidance. After all these developments in governance, we hoped that we had it sorted. But then the financial crisis came along, and a number of banks failed, and we're all paying for it now. They failed in the USA, they failed in the UK, and they failed on mainland Europe. But there are marked differences in approach to corporate governance in each of these 3 areas. But yet there were failures in all of them. It would be wrong to blame the financial crisis entirely on corporate governance, but there were many significant failings. Bank boards said no one could have predicted what would happen. Politicians and regulators said the same thing. All the main players said that they weren't to blame. So no one was to blame, and no one could have foreseen events. Yet we had shareholders who didn't hold boards to account, shareholders who didn't prevent bank failure or massive losses. We had non-executive directors that didn't hold management to account. We saw what, with hindsight, seems like reckless risk-taking. But is it worse than just non-executives and shareholders not holding people to account? Vince Cable said that the CEO of a failed UK bank admitted to him that its lending was foolish and dangerous, but told him that he would have been fired by his board if he had reduced lending. I wonder if the non-executives thought that the city would have complained had lending been scaled back. So what happened? Was it that these institutions that failed and suffered billions in losses, didn't they comply with best governance practice? No, they all complied. Was it then that they didn't have proper risk management systems? Well, at the time, these banks were all thought to have leading-edge risk management. The SEC and rating agencies thought that Lehman's risk management in particular was good, better than other banks. In 2007, the external auditors of UBS made an in-depth examination of the UBS's group reporting process. And they reported that these processes were adequate to ensure that the key risks reported by the business groups were adequately included in the group risk reporting, and that the group risk reporting processes were not complex and were performed by experienced professionals. Now, had I been a member of an audit committee, I think I would have taken some comfort from that. Just after Northern Rock hit the buffers, I met an audit committee chair from one of the now failed Irish banks over a drink. I asked him if it was actually very difficult for an audit committee to get all the right information it needs to satisfy itself about the effectiveness of risk management. Not a bit of it, he said. In all sincerity, we have very good people working for us who prepare good information. He had no concerns at all. I guess he should have done. 2 years ago, we issued Corporate Governance and the Credit Crunch, and I hope there'll be some copies. I think they're on their way. We identified that corporate governance practice was wrong. And this was that we identified a series of corporate governance failures as well, and the ways in which governance has failed. This was at a time when pretty well everyone else was saying that there wasn't a problem of corporate governance, it was something else. And it's worth looking at it, and hopefully the copies will be ready. We felt that the root of the problem was that governance practice was wrong. There was compliance with the form, but not the substance of good governance. The problems were with culture, human behaviour, incentives and motivation, or if you like, greed and turning a blind eye. When the 2003 Combined Code came out after Higgs and Smith, ACCA said that there are no provisions or principles in the code which focus on the broad framework of corporate responsibility. It appears to have ignored those who feel let down by business leaders and the investment community as the extent of corporate greed and negative social impact becomes clearer. Since then, we've been calling for our governance code to focus more on culture, ethics and values. While companies only have to state their compliance with code provisions, they're required to state how they apply the main principles. We've repeatedly suggested that companies report how the board discharged its responsibility, currently in a supporting principle, for setting the values and standards of an organisation. Sir David Walker rightly said that governance failures were a behavioural issue. I agree, but his recommendations, well, will they bring about the desired behaviour? But we're glad to see that following Walker, the new UK Corporate Governance Code says in its third paragraph that corporate governance is about what the board of a company does and how it sets the values of the company. Why then are the provisions and main principles of the code silent on the subject of values or ethics? And why is the new stewardship code also silent on this? How do you get the right behaviour? Michel Barnier, the EC Commissioner, said in a speech last month, "I'm clear we will not be able to rely only on voluntary codes." Perhaps not, but can we rely any better on rules? Regulation has unintended consequences. What we saw in the crisis, time after time, were people who didn't so much play by the rules, but they gamed the rules. It's the incentives that drive behaviour, and we need to get smarter. The stock response to governance shortcomings is to add more governance requirements and try and make them more binding. In the UK, we've got the new UK code, and we're hoping that the stewardship code will make it more binding. It could, but I think its emphasis needs to change to focus more upon how companies apply the code principles rather than the provisions. And it's difficult, of course, to gain principles if someone's shining a light on what's happening and people are watching. And so what we need, I think, is for shareholders to watch and for the boards to shine a light through proper reporting. In a piece of research just published, looking at nearly 300 firms across 30 countries, it was found that firms with more independent boards and higher institutional ownership had worse stock returns during the crisis period. They said firms of higher institutional ownership took more risk, which resulted in larger shareholder losses. They thought that cast doubt on whether regulatory changes to increase the activism of shareholders and monitoring by outside directors would be effective. Perhaps we should go back to basics. The Cadbury report said the principles on which the code is based are those of openness, integrity and accountability. They go together. Openness on the part of companies is the basis for the confidence which needs to exist between business and all those who have a stake in its success. An open approach to the disclosure of information contributes to efficient working of the market economy, prompts boards to take effective action, and allows shareholders and others to scrutinise companies more thoroughly. Cadbury said that integrity meant straightforward dealing and completeness. He said boards are accountable to shareholders and they should both play their part in making that accountability effective. Boards need to do so through the quality of their reporting and shareholders in the way they exercise their responsibilities as owners. Surely the job of anyone interested in good governance is to work out how to have real openness, integrity and accountability over what really matters about performance, values and principles rather than compliance. Thanks very much.